Hello, excuse me. Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Project on Middle East Democracy event, The End of Tunisia's Democratic Path for Now. I'm Amy Hawthorne, Deputy Director of Research at POMED, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. We're meeting here today at a crucial turning point in Tunisia. For many Tunisians, a very, very dark turning point. It's 2 days after Tunisia held a controversial referendum to approve President Kaïs Saïed's controversial new constitution. And it's a little more than 1 year since Kaïs Saïed's soft coup of last July 25th, in which he grabbed all powers and has been ruling basically alone ever since, dismantling democratic institutions and eroding rights and freedoms. Now, his new constitution is designed to officially replace Tunisia's hard-won democracy with a new system in which the president will have essentially unchecked power. It's a new dictatorship in the making, 11 and a half years after Tunisians overthrew their old one. This new constitution apparently does not have the approval of the overwhelming majority of Tunisians. The electoral authorities claim that about 30% of Tunisians turned out to vote, and that 94% of them voted yes. But as we will discuss today, there are many, many questions about the conduct of the referendum, about the constitution, and about Kaïs Saïed's level of support. And of course, the backdrop to all of this is a deteriorating economic situation in Tunisia. As Kaïs Saïed has been setting up his new autocracy, Tunisia is sliding ever more toward an economic emergency. I'm very pleased to host this conversation today with two outstanding analysts of Tunisia. We have Mohamed-Dhia Hammami and Monica Marks. Mohamed-Dhia is a doctoral student in political science at Syracuse University, and Monica is a professor of Middle East politics at New York University, Abu Dhabi. They are both very close and very insightful observers of Tunisian politics since the 2011 revolution, and Dhia for even longer, since he was born and grew up in Ben Ali's Tunisia. Their full bios are on our POMED event webpage if you'd like to read more about our speakers. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here with us today. So over the next hour, I'm going to pose a number of questions to Mohamed-Dhia and to Monica. And we're going to look at the referendum and then discuss what might be coming next in Tunisia. And if we can squeeze it in toward the end, I'll pose some audience questions to our speakers if we have time. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom or send your question by email to communications@pomed.org. And as I said, if we have enough time, I'll turn to some of your questions at the end. I'd like to start off by asking Mohamed-Dhia about Monday's referendum. How credible was this event? And thus, how much legitimacy does it grant to President Kaïs Saïed's new constitution? What do we know about the reliability of turnout figures, the integrity of electoral administration, and so forth? And how much did Tunisians know or understand about the constitution that they were being asked to approve? Over to you, Mohamed-Dhia.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for having me. So it was a sham election aimed at granting Kaïs Saïed the legitimacy he needs for his new political system after destroying the existing political order. UGDT, for example, has previously pointed out to the fact that nothing in the 2014 constitution allows the president to organize such a referendum. For those who considered and called last year's event a military-backed self-coup, the referendum is presented as a tainted fruit of the poison tree. In Arabic, the expression would be "ما بني على باطل فهو باطل." And even on the side of those who initially had an optimistic view of what they call the July 25th process, we end up seeing a lot of critiques and calls for boycott. They critiqued the exclusionary character of the pseudo consultation that preceded it. They denounced the way Saïed ended up writing the constitution by himself. And they didn't also want to give legitimacy to a constitution that would establish a dictatorial regime. And however, we still found that 1/4 of the Tunisian population doesn't seem that concerned about legality of the process or the legitimacy of the constitution, and we should keep that in mind. Regarding the turnout rate, we should specify, I think, the second lowest turnout in history of constitutional referenda after Algeria's 2020 referendum. The data collected in mid-July by at least 2 polling companies predicted something around 20% of participation. So when polling stations were closing, EZ announced something that is not that far. 27 doesn't seem that far from what these companies predicted. It's also close enough from the 25% estimated by the exit polls. But yesterday, EZ came up with a new number that is 16% higher than when they initially announced. It's not clear where they found these 400,000 new votes. The number is pretty big. These revision raised concerns about the credibility of the result among both Tunisian and non-Tunisian observers. And things got worse when the Electoral Commission, we should remind everyone that it was appointed by Saïed himself as a replacement for the previously elected commission. So things got worse when they published a new inconsistent data about the regional distribution of the votes, and then deleted them when people pointed out to these discrepancies. And they published new data that doesn't exactly match what they published yesterday. So there are a lot of question points that we can ask. Regarding your last question, most voters did not read the Constitution, and the exit polls confirmed that. And I saw a screenshot of a question circulating on Facebook, someone asking, well, now after I voted yes, can someone explain to me what I voted for? Because I don't understand politics that much. And I guess it reflects pretty much what the average Tunisian who showed up to yesterday, to Monday's referendum know about the new Tunisian constitution.
Thank you, Mohamed-Dhia. Monica, before I turn to you with a question about the new constitution, what Kaïs Saïed may do next, is there anything that you'd like to add to Mohamed-Dhia's comments? We should note that you are currently in Tunisia. You've been there for almost a month. So you were there on the ground as all of this has been unfolding in recent weeks.
Yeah, I've been interviewing elections integrity experts today who say that we cannot validate EZ's reported results of the referendum without a comprehensive elections forensic audit that would include a comprehensive analysis of the legal framework, campaigning, preparation, voter awareness, and the polling and tabulation of results. And of course, as Dhia was alluding to, most of those things we've already known now for weeks add up to an illegitimate election, add up to an undemocratic election, because No and the boycott have not had equal opportunity to campaign and raise voter awareness. EZ made a decision not to even dignify the boycott as a valid section of public opinion that deserved representation in media and campaigning. So they only gave a limited access to media to the No campaign. And I repeat, a limited access, because public television was not interviewing, inviting any advocates for no or for boycott. But for the boycott campaign, they didn't even dignify it as a section of public opinion that needed representation. And of course, that, along with so much else, was really a blatant violation of best global practice. Another blatant violation was the haphazard, rushed nature of all of this. I've been interviewing elections observers in the south, center of the country, and here in Tunis, and they've said across the board that the organization of this election has been far worse, disastrously worse than anything they've seen since 2011. A lot of people don't know if they're going to get paid for having participated. There wasn't enough time to train everybody. The number of elections observers for whom it was their very first time doing elections observation was huge. I spoke with trainers who told me that a lot of the people who were being trained were rapidly recruited, and some of them had never even seen an elections voting box before. They themselves had never voted. So let alone be able to record and monitor all instances of violations. These people probably wouldn't even be able to spot all violations. Most observers were boycotting domestically and internationally because they viewed this as an illegitimate election. So the European Union, the Carter Center, and most domestic civil society organizations, including iWatch and others, were not observing. So really, we're relying on Murakiboon's parallel vote tabulation, or PVT, as the only remotely independent indication of whether EASY's results are credible. And of course, as Dhia said, EASY itself was taken over by Kaïs Saïed in late April. So it's not independent. EASY went from being one of the most democratic elections observations bodies in the region to adopting a governmental model of elections organization. I meant to say, not observation. Now, the problem with Murakiboon's PVT is they haven't made their methodology transparent. We don't know how they chose their sampling sites. And they also said in a press conference yesterday that they've been recording turnout based on EASY's reported numbers of turnout, the numbers that EASY officials at polling stations are giving them, rather than standing there with a clicker or something and doing their own independently verifiable tabulation of the turnout. We've always known that turnout would be the area where Kaïs or his non-independent elections commission would inflate the results. We knew that the outcome of this referendum was going to be yes, no matter what, because there was no minimum threshold, which meant that theoretically, if only one Tunisian in the whole country came out to vote and they voted yes, this referendum would have passed, which was another blatant violation of global standards for binding referenda. And it looks like, given everything that Dhia said about this 16% increase in alleged voter turnout overnight, there might be some inflation going on. EASY is asking us to believe that Kaïs Saïed has almost as many supporters as he did in the second round of the 2019 elections. They're asking us to believe that he's only lost 170,000 approximately supporters. And that, just to be frank, it doesn't match up with any of the polling we had in the run-up to this election. And it doesn't match up with what any of us researchers or good journalists are seeing on the ground, anecdotally either.
Thank you, Monica and Mohamed-Dhia, for that very sort of comprehensive overview of real concerns about the integrity of this process. I should note that, according to my understanding, Murakiboon has said that they chose the polling stations where they deployed observers based on a statistically valid random sampling in order to come up with a representative group of polling stations. But I think a lot of people have been asking for more information about their methodology. I think that would be very helpful. So I just wanted to note that. Monica, let me turn to ask you, now that Kaïs Saïed has his rammed through his new constitution, that some say he's had in mind, or key elements of it he's had in mind for many, many, many years. Now he has his opportunity to implement it. This constitution that gives him essentially unchecked power, erodes checks and balances, subordinates formerly sort of independent institutions, and many believe poses real risk to the protection of rights and freedoms. So a transformation of Tunisia's formerly democratic system with all of its flaws, challenges, and problems, but a democratic system to something that on paper looks like an autocracy led by Kaïs Saïed. So what do you expect President Saïed to do next to implement his constitution, to consolidate his new autocracy? Are you expecting dramatic moves, a real shift in the political environment, an acceleration of repression, a widening of repression? You've been in Tunisia for many weeks now. How worried are Tunisians you've spoken to about sort of what it's, the actual full implementation of a new dictatorship? Or is that what the president is going to do? What do you kind of expect next?
Well, to the extent that we could ever call this unconstitutional and illegitimate referendum legal, Kaïs Saïed has rendered his de facto personal rule by fiat de jure. It doesn't really change the balance of power. Saïed ruled with godlike authority since July 25th by decree, and he's ruling that way after. But now he can point to a whole shrubbery of legal fig leaves in this new constitution that he seems to have single-handedly authored and say, hey, listen, this is what the people voted for, isn't it? And he's counting on, state-influenced media and not so critical international press picking up on this 94.6% yes vote figure to say, well, people actually came out and they voted for this and they said yes. To get to your question more specifically, Amy, Kaïs Saïed has been really obsessed with his new esoteric political vision for upending and reshaping Tunisia's whole political system since day one. That's the one area in which he's been extremely consistent. I think a lot of international actors, and there are some folks in different embassies, are sitting around hoping with their fingers crossed that he's going to use whatever newfound political capital he may or may not have drummed up in this sham process to make some IMF reforms, some difficult economic reforms that the IMF has been calling for. But we've had zero indication that he's thinking about Tunisia's economy in any way, shape, or form. Instead, we've had every indication very consistently across the past year, even beforehand, that he's been like an old man sitting on the top of stairs in an attic, dithering, tinkering with a toy train set. And this toy train set is his vision of a new political system. It's an esoteric vision. One could call it a populist authoritarian vision, but I don't even think it's populist in the genuine sense that it reflects anything that people want, because as Dhia mentioned, the people haven't been calling for a new constitution at all. They've been desperately calling for their political leadership to solve their economic problems. The state of Tunisia's economy is dire. It's worse than at any point since I started traveling to Tunisia, all the way back in 2007. Kaïs' system, you could also maybe characterize it as like anarcho-authoritarian. He was influenced by Rida Lenina, one of his friends. That's his nickname. That tells you a lot, that's one of his closest compadres here, who had this rather romantic idea that world politics needed remaking, that people globally, I've interviewed this guy, so I'm speaking from the interview with Rida Lenina here, that people globally were disillusioned with party politics and that you needed some kind of like radical local governance that's simultaneously going to be a highly centralized presidential system, almost in an hourglass shape here with a highly centralized presidential system on top, and then the best thing for direct democracy since ancient Athens and sliced bread on the bottom. In this hypocrisy, in this contradiction between the rhetoric of direct democracy and local governance and the reality of presidential authoritarianism, we see echoes of Gaddafi's Jamahiriya state in Libya in the 1970s and 80s. I don't know if Kaïs Saïed or any of his confidants like Lenina were reading Gaddafi's Green Book, but that's the closest thing I can think of. So he's going to start with the elections law. He's already announced that he's going to be thinking about the elections law. We should be on the lookout for him to isolate political opponents. he caved in to someone, we don't know where he was getting some pressure, but it's likely he was, on the second draft of his constitution by saying that the National Assembly, so he has this two-chamber idea of elected assembly, there would be the Mejlis Jihat, these local councils, local assemblies on the bottom, which is very much in keeping with this Jamahiriya-esque vision I was talking about, and then the National Assembly on the top, and he caved in and said, okay, the National Assembly, I'm going to allow it to be directly elected. But it is up to Kaïs and Kaïs alone what directly elected means. So he could still, massage this into this weird esoteric train in the attic vision. It's up to him and him alone when the elections will be held, if there are elections, which parties will be allowed to compete, if parties will be allowed to compete. So a lot remains, everything actually remains to be determined, and to be determined by Kaïs Saïed himself. How worried are Tunisians? Between a fourth and a third of Tunisians are highly worried. They view this as a dictatorship that is totally illegitimate. About a fourth of Tunisians probably are not only not worried, but hopeful or even still supportive, albeit often, but not always, less enthusiastic than they were last summer. But the vast majority of Tunisians, as Dhia said, are clued out and unconcerned. They're exhausted. That's the word you hear most often here in Tunisia. We're exhausted. We are so focused on the economy, on just surviving, affording couscous, affording pasta, bread, that we don't have the bandwidth to focus on the political situation. And it's this section of Tunisians who are liable to rapidly lose faith in Saïed if he doesn't deliver. Now, maybe he'll keep throwing them red meat and blaming his corrupt opponents for his failures. We'll see, but he's in a very vulnerable position because he has no choice but to focus on the economic problems that have bedeviled his predecessors, but he's showing absolutely no inclination to do that.
Thank you, Monica. Echoes of Gaddafi's Green Book. It's kind of a haunting image. We'll see. Mohamed-Dhia, I want to turn back to you and ask you about the president's supporters. He has many. According to polls, his public support has steadily declined over the last year, but I believe that polls show that he has more political support than any other political figure in Tunisia, according to public opinion surveys, at least that I've seen. So he is popular, at least among some Tunisians. Can you tell us, at this point, excuse me, a year after his power grab of July 25th, 2021, who makes up his popular base? Why do they support him? And what about his backing? What do we know, if anything, about his backing or support from within the Tunisian state, from inside the power structure? Is he stronger than he was a year ago in power, or is he more vulnerable than he was a year ago? Over to you, Mohamed-Dhia.
Thank you. So yes, as you said, Kaïs Saïed is until now the most popular politician out of those who are already visible and have been active during the last years. But it doesn't mean that he cannot be challenged by new political figures. Regarding your question on the composition of his base. So in 2019, when he got elected, youth represented a major proportion of Saïed's voters. But on Monday, both pictures that we saw circulating on social media and exit polls show that the average age is significantly higher. So it's mostly people in their 40s and going up. Regarding the gender, there is a major imbalance. 66% of the voters were men and only 33% were women. This can be explained by many factors that I'll be happy to talk about maybe later. If there is any question, geographically, I tried to see if there is at least a simple association between the level of development using regional development indicators and the voting intensity. At that time, I didn't have the voting, the regional turnout yet. And I didn't find even a simple correlation, so which means that we should be skeptical of economic productionist argument presenting the rise of support to Said as a simple argument about economic deprivation. But the word base in Tunisian political jargon also indicates the informal mobilization network, not just the voting the voting base. And when we look at, I've been trying to follow their activity on social media, scraping some data and looking at their networks and try to get a sense of who they are. And what I can say is that most of them are young and middle-aged men, very active in the main metropoles of Tunis, mostly Tunis and Sfax, with a few in the interior region, but mostly in the main cities. And they are extremely active on social media, even when we compare them to the opposition, for example. Regarding the Said's reliance on the state apparatus, what we can say that so far he still have the support of the bureaucracy and the Ministry of Interior, although the purge that happened last fall raised some concerns among police unions, and his late night visits where he would be shouting at top officers of the Ministry of Interior and talking about infiltration of institutions and things like that is not positively welcomed by top security officers. But at the same time, when we look at the military, we see a shift, for example, in the attitude of prominent and influential retired military officers, at least. We don't have enough visibility over the active ones, but among the retired military officers, Kamal Akrut, for example, the ex-national security advisor of President Kaïs Saïed and the former head of the military intelligence, is more and more critiquing Saïed. We saw also Mukhtar bin Nasser, who was a spokesperson at the moment of the Ministry of Defense, who claimed that July 25th had enough support from the military, is now becoming critical of him. But we also find retired military officers, especially people who worked under Ben Ali, like Ahmed Shabir, who seem to be more nostalgic to Ben Ali kind of rule and more supportive than. So there is if we extrapolate from these few examples, at least, it seems that there is not a consensus over the figure of Said and his general orientation. We find the same divisions within UGTT's leadership. Those who are closer to the pan-Arabist Shab are supportive of Said, but the rest are not. In fact, I tried to see which of the executive members of UGTT voted in the referendum, and so far I was able to identify only one who is in fact closer from that part of the political spectrum. I also, using data that are previously collected on business elites, I tried to code and identify influential and central business actors who to code them based on their attitude towards Said using simple binary 0-1. And it was pretty difficult actually to find business people who are vocal about their support to Said. The only few ones that I found were people who were targeted, for example, by the confiscation process shortly after the revolution. All the others who survived seem skeptical, very skeptical of Said and vocal about that. But at the same time, the large majority are silent, and looking at their Facebook posts, looking at their media declaration, I noticed that most of them are even those who were involved in politics before the coup are keeping quiet, and this may have to do with Saïed's discourse regarding business elites. Finally, the civilian opposition, or the opposition, the classic opposition, the party-based opposition, they are organizationally divided, yes, but ideationally there is some level of unity against Saïed. In fact, yesterday, the Secretary General of Ashab in an interview said that for the first time we see the leftist people from the old regime, who was referring to Abir Musi's political party, and also what he calls liberals, it's not clear who he was talking about, are unified against Saïed. So maybe from our perspective, when we look at the organizational cooperation between different factions of the opposition, we see a weakness, but from their point of view, from the point of view of those who are supportive of Saïed, they are somehow unified. And when we look at even at the literature on pacted transition or elite cohesion, we found that there is no consensus on what type of cohesion and unity matter. Is it organizational or ideational? Are we talking about the already established elites or the elite versus the counter elite? Because a big part of the argument is about the counter elite, like so for people like Rida Lenin and Ahmed Shaftar and people like that. So it's not the literature on elite cohesion is not that consistent. Finally, what I would say is that although this division, if we can assume this organization division and this fear among business elite plays politically in Saïed's favor, economically it doesn't. In a country like Tunisia, where economic coordination doesn't happen that much through market mechanism, but it happens through active cooperation and discussion and collusion between economic actors and political actors, this environment prevents any form of any efficient implementation of reforms or simple distribution of public goods. It leads to so many collective action problems. And in addition to the fact that Saïed doesn't have a coherent view, and maybe we can talk about this later, of the economy, this division that he created and the destruction of public trust in institution will prevent him from delivering and from responding to the average Tunisian expectation regarding the economy.
Thank you so much, Mohamed-Dhia. If you could answer in a yes or no question before I turn to Monica, in your assessment, is Kaïs Saïed stronger or weaker than he was a year ago? Or maybe it's not possible to answer that right now.
No, I think it's I feel comfortable answering that he is definitely weaker. If he, for example, wanted to move to full dictatorial oppression efficiently, he maybe should have done that shortly after his coup, but he missed that opportunity when the level of support was high among both the masses and elites. Glad he didn't do that. But right now he has a lot of problems.
Thank you very much. Monica, I want to now ask you, building on what Mohamed-Dhia said, and he spoke a little bit about the opposition, but I would very much welcome your thoughts on the organized opposition to Kaïs Saïed and the potential or latent opposition to Kaïs Saïed. Mohamed-Dhia has described a large swath of Tunisian public opinion that is not engaged. So are these people who could be mobilized, for or against Saïed's plan? But specifically on the opposition, tell us sort of what it looks like at this time. After his constitution has passed, the opposition was unable to derail his plans for, his long held plans to have this new his dream constitution approved by the voters. At the same time, there may be relatively more unity among the opposition than there was a year ago. So what does the opposition look like to you at this point? What's their next move? And what is the alternative to Kaïs Saïed? What could the opposition propose to the Tunisian public and important people within the power structure that would look like to them a better alternative than the Kaïs Saïed governance right now? Over to you, Monica.
Big questions.
I'm asking you both very hard questions because you're both brilliant political scientists. So.
1 year ago, when Kaïs Saïed made his presidential coup, there was a significant stream of Tunisian intelligentsia that was saying to critics, sit back, don't worry, trust the Tunisian people, because Tunisian civil society is very strong, and you can trust Tunisia's civil society to stand up and stop this if there's any hint of him becoming an authoritarian. 1 year on, Kaïs Saïed now has the crowning jewel in his long, continuous process of dictatorial consolidation, which was Monday's referendum. And civil society, neither civil society nor Tunisia's political parties have managed to stand up and stop him. That does not mean, of course, that Kaïs Saïed is not weaker today than he was 1 year ago. That's an easy question. He most certainly is. I think about the crowds I saw on Avenue Habbi Bourguiba on Monday night versus the kinds of crowds you saw supporting Saïed and cheering, coming out in their droves, cheering his takeover, his power grab on July 25th of last year. I mean, there's no comparison. I really just saw a few hundred people on Avenue Habbi Bourguiba intermittently chanting, and then sitting behind me on the stairs of the municipal theater were a couple dozen Tunisians just staring at them blankly. That was more the vibe on Monday night. Very different feeling. I think Kaïs Saïed himself, through this vanity referendum that he held, exploded the myth of himself as an unsullied, direct embodiment of the people's will. And that was a myth that you heard all the time last year. Well, he is what Ashab yurid, he is what the people want. And now, even based on Easy's own self-reported numbers, which themselves are specious, it's clear that doesn't add up. Is the opposition uniting? I think they're certainly more united than they were a year ago. And I think Kaïs Saïed's vanity referendum has given them a point of opposition to rally around. Unlike a year ago, when you really just had a handful of political parties who'd stood up against him, and when civil society, tragically, was mostly behind him 1 year ago, today, pretty much all political parties, except the small Arab nationalist party, Harakat al-Shab, have been either saying no or boycott the referendum, so they're against him. And civil society is broad swaths of civil society. I think a majority of civil society is against him too, although in some of your older legacy civil society organizations here, including the powerful trade union, UGTT, including the Tunisian League of Human Rights, there's a lot of internal division in some of these older organizations that you see playing out in really obvious ways, like the Tunisian League of Human Rights airing their dirty laundry on their very own Facebook page, where you had Bashir Al-Abidi, one of their leaders, criticizing, deriding Bassem Trifi, his opponent within the league, for having written this statement denouncing Kaïs Saïed's constitution as authoritarian. So you see a lot of stuff like that. I think neither civil society nor political parties are confident of their ability to mobilize Tunisians. I was pressing one of my old friends who's a top leader in Femmes Democrates, the ATFD, the other night. Why aren't you calling all Tunisian women to stand up and march against this thing, given how much farther Article 5 of Saïed's constitution goes in establishing what you could call political Islam, and quite a patriarchal retrogressive interpretation of it, than Ennahda ever proposed in their wildest dreams. Why aren't you getting thousands of women on the street like you were in August 2012 against the first draft of the Constituent Assembly's constitution? which said much milder things, which didn't go even really a tenth as far as Saïed's draft went. And she basically said, and this has been confirmed by other folks in that organization and others to me, that we're not confident we can mobilize people, and it's going to take more time because of what we were talking about, how your average Tunisian is so exhausted and so cynical right now. They look at any suggestion of a new political program as cliched and untrustworthy after 10 years of trying all these different permutations of party politics and not seeing anything really deliver in concrete, tangible ways, dividends of the 2011 revolution. What's their next move? Are they going to compete in Saïed's legislative elections or not, if he actually holds them and if he actually allows them to compete? I'm not sure. It's entirely possible that if he allows some parties but not others, they might not all boycott to the extent that they did this time. That's possible. That could divide them. What's their alternative? Is anybody proposing an alternative to Kaïs Saïed? No, not really. And this is really the million dinar question. This is the hardest nut to crack. Even though there's a lot of opposition in Tunisia's political elite, there are no new fresh faces. And this gets back to an old problem in Tunisian politics that you see pretty much across all the political parties and across a lot of the civil society organizations too, which is older leaders, usually older men, not knowing when to exit stage left and not getting out of the way. I had an interesting interview with Ahmed Najib Chebi, who has been at the forefront of cross-ideological coalition building against dictatorships under Ben Ali and today, a few weeks ago. And I was pressing him a little bit. I was saying, Najib, what do you say to young people who say, you're not the most inspiring face to have at the top of Jabhat Khalas, the Salvation Front, the closest thing to an organized opposition that includes Nahda and a few other parties. And he said, well, listen, they need to stand up. We need some kind of leadership to stand up at a moment like this. And young people seem so cynical that they're definitely not engaging in politics and they're not standing up. That was his defense. And I asked him, what do you say to Westerners who say, listen, Tunisia's opposition isn't that unified. They're not all unified under one organizational umbrella. So how much can you actually expect us to do? And he said, listen, in a democratic Tunisia, you can't expect everybody to want to stand shoulder to shoulder together, especially given what Hammami in his interview with me that I published in Jadaliya last year called the Nahda syndrome, which Hama, despite his very cogent critique himself, fell a little bit victim to. He won't join Jabhat Khalas, for example. In other words, the Islamist factor. Chebi was saying, especially given that Ennahda seems to have this reverse Midas touch, and political parties and civil society organizations are scared of working with them. You can't expect all of them to be unified in one organization, but there is quite a lot, as Dhia was saying, of ideational unity insofar as they're opposed to Kaïs Saïed's dictatorship, and that's what we should be looking at. So I don't really see a lot of inspiring positive action on the clear-cut, fresh faces organizational alternative front, but there is a lot of broad unity insofar as we've seen the opposition, well, the political elite, I should say, and the civil society elite really start to congeal more around this idea that Saïed is a dictator. And you can see it today. They're calling the referendum illegitimate and the outcome unreliable.
Thank you so much. Before I turn back to Mohamed-Dhia to ask him about the economy, I just want to share a comment from one of our viewers in Tunisia that's come through in the Q&A. And this is someone watching from Tunisia. And he says, Tunisian people refuse both the previous political figures and this new process of Kaïs Saïed. They don't find yet the trusted and good alternative. So people are neglecting the political life until a good alternative emerges. Youth is the solution. We are coming someday. I thought that was a very interesting comment from Wejdi, and I just wanted to share that as food for thought. Mohamed-Dhia, turning back to you, we know that the really tough economic situation in Tunisia a year ago played a big role in opening the door for Kaïs Saïed's power grab. But the president has been mysterious, shall we say, about his plans for dealing with the economic crisis, about his vision for the economy. So now that the referendum is behind him, what is his plan for the economy? What might we expect from him? And how is he going to stave off this, looming Tunisia sliding off a cliff economically?
Right. The coup occurred in the context of acute deterioration of economic conditions, like most coups. That's what we know from the literature on coups or similar military-backed power grabs. Saïed, like most coup plotters, simply seized the moment created this time by the COVID pandemic to conduct his autocracy. But regarding his plans, I don't think he has a comprehensive economic plan to fix the economy. We know about his ideological orientations, for example. He's very skeptical or I would say even highly critical of the post-structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and the economic liberalization. He is against the free trade agreement with the EU. We know, and he is nostalgic to the kind of 1960s state-led development, but these are general ideas. But when it comes to concrete policy solutions, he doesn't have that much to say. Or what we know that he wants to build some kind of state-controlled, state-funded pseudo-cooperative entrepreneurial project. So basically, like, he claims that people have ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, and I'm very skeptical of that. In Tunisia, we don't have that strong entrepreneurial culture. And he thinks that all what the state needs is to fund these projects. And he also wants to make a reconciliation with corrupt business people and then find them and redistribute or like assign them regions so they get in charge of them and develop them somehow. I don't think this kind of ideas fit to Tunisian needs. Whether we're talking about fixing structural issues in the Tunisian economy or responding to Tunisian expectations of improvement of the living conditions. Most of people who voted for him are not planning to create a company that will be sponsored by Saïed's system. Most of them are either looking for jobs in the public sector, in state-owned companies, or simply they're expecting their wages to go up and inflation to go down, and that doesn't happen through this kind of mechanisms. Regarding the IMF, I think it will only make things more difficult. It will not improve the overall situation in the short run, at least, and respond to people's expectation. In fact, the IMF's role is not to deal with microeconomic problems. It's usually to stabilize the grand equilibriums of the economy. And it may signal, it may send a green light to other donors to get involved, but it doesn't mean, as long as we don't have a clear, comprehensive economic program that would be designed in an inclusive way, so we do not have the collective action problem that I was talking about that can emerge from problems of fear, access to information, visibility, threat of repression. It's pretty difficult to see the end of the tunnel regarding the economic situation.
And you're talking about the potential IMF loan, which IMF officials have been discussing with Tunisian government officials. That money is needed to help Tunisia avoid bankruptcy, but it's going to come with possibly very tough austerity measures that are extremely unpopular in Tunisia. So this will be a huge challenge for Kaïs Saïed. What does he do? Some people think that with his autocratic powers, he'll be able to impose these unpopular economic policies on Tunisians, but the landscape, the political landscape that you both are describing today makes me wonder if that is even possible, should he even wish to do that. Monica, in our remaining minutes, I want to turn to you and then back to Mohamed-Dhia to close and ask you what you think the international community in democracies around the world, governments like the United States and some European countries that claim to support Tunisian democracy, what should they be doing now? How should they respond to this situation? I wanted to mention that just shortly after this event, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will be holding a hearing for the next ambassador, the ambassador nominee, Biden's nominee to become ambassador to Tunisia, Joey Hood. And so whoever steps, assuming he's going to step into that role soon, what would you advise the US to do in response to the situation, and European countries as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I think they want to provide humanitarian assistance to Tunisia without providing dictatorial assistance to Kaïs Saïed to help him consolidate his authoritarian regime. I think they should also be more critical than most of them have been throughout the bulk of the past year. We saw just in the past 24 hours, I think, a salutary statement from Ned Price at the State Department that was a step in the right direction. But we've also seen some real lowlights over the past year, both on the US side and the EU side. And I'll just quickly run through what I think are the four lowest lowlights. On December 13th, when Kaïs Saïed announced his roadmap, which was really a highway to dictatorial consolidation, the State Department said, quote, "We welcome Saïed's announcement of a path for political reform," which could have been read as a statement with mystifying credulity, even tacit support. On April 5th, former US Ambassador Donald Bloom allowed himself to be awarded, to be garlanded by Kaïs Saïed in a photo op ceremony just days after the March 30th virtual meeting of Tunisia's democratically elected parliamentarians. This was amidst Kaïs Saïed dragging those elected MPs in front of counterterrorism units, charging them with attempting a coup, charges that carried the death penalty, actually, for these elected parliamentarians. This was right in the thick of all of that. So I thought that was just shameful. On July 11th, the European Union released statements calling the Kaïs Saïed's constitutional referendum a, quote, process towards institutional normalcy and democratic balance. And then lastly, on July 23rd, just 2 days before the most pivotal moment in Kaïs's process of dictatorial consolidation, the US Embassy here in Tunis released photos of the chargé rescuing turtles. So there have been a number of instances in which the United States and other Western powers have seemed absurdly clued out or even tacitly complicit. Now, there have also been some salutary exceptions to that, like the statement by Ned Price, and I would urge those statements of criticism, hedging, concerns, deep concerns to continue, and on a substantive policy level to ensure that Western powers are not actually aiding Saïed in consolidating his dictatorship. I would also say, just lastly, that the idea that Saïed could have an undemocratic referendum on a constitution that he himself appeared to have authored, that was launched from a coup, the idea that that process could bring any sort of institutional stability or normalcy is absurdly misplaced. He's not a garden variety dictator. He's not a Ben Ali style person who knows how to co-opt the co-optable. If you compare Ben Ali's takeover in 1987 to Kaïs Saïed's takeover, you see Kaïs Saïed slamming the door on every potential ally. There was a whole pool of people last year in political parties and civil society who were cheerleading what Saïed did and were waiting, metaphorically waiting for the presidential ping by the phone. And that ping never came. They were never included. He even slammed the door on the labor union, which I never thought I'd see a politician do in Tunisia. So this is not an inclusive person. This is an esoteric, fixated person who has systematically isolated potential allies. And it's going to be hard for him to make difficult economic reforms having less institutional legitimacy than his predecessors did.
Thank you so much. And in our remaining minutes, Dhia, would you like to weigh in on what the international community should be doing or not doing? Tunisia is in a in a dire economic situation, should the international community stand back and let that economic situation get worse? There's some critical, policy questions here. I just also wondered if either of you, starting with Dia and Monica, if we have time, would like to react to an interesting question that came through from one of our viewers, which is essentially asking, noting that the United States and other Western countries have provided a lot of funding and support for Tunisian civil society organizations and to strengthen political parties on over the past decade. Has this borne the expected fruits? Perhaps not. And should there be kind of a reckoning and a relook at that kind of support? Is this a moment for reflection by donors? Over to you. Thank you.
Over to me or over to Dia?
Sorry.
I didn't hear you. Was that mine or
Sorry,
Dia's?
Mohamed-Dhia.
Okay, sorry, I was also confused. So regarding so when we say the US, if we ask the US to step back, I don't think the US will. In fact, they will keep providing aid to the security apparatus, and that's the problem. In the sense that on one side we hear the US government saying it's the role of Tunisians to fight for themselves, and I totally agree. But at the same time, providing the weapons that the Ministry of Interior will use against opposition, to shrinking the space of freedom that we gained, and make change lesser and lesser possible. I think there is a contradiction there. So I think that the US should at least be clear regarding abuse of human rights and targeting of politicians and activists, to keep that minimum level of freedom and liberties, to use the 2006 expression used by Tunisian opposition back then, so we can keep fighting. Otherwise, if Saïed continues to target the opposition using the military apparatus, which is US backed and US funded, or the Ministry of Interior, which is also US trained, I think there is a problem there. So it's a set red line, especially regarding top officers, not just politicians, top officers who get trained in the US, who get involved in abuse of human rights. We saw top officers of the Ministry of Interior involved in repression a few days ago, and many of them will end up either engaging in security business once they leave the Ministry of Interior, or they leave and work with UN organizations. And I think there is a leverage there, at least to keep the existing amount of freedom that we have, to preserve it. And I don't have any higher expectations.
Yeah, so what you're talking about, Mohamed-Dhia, is international community, US and others kind of using whatever leverage or influence they have over Kaïs Saïed, which may not be extensive, but to at least prevent things from getting worse, to keep that small space, that space that still does exist, although it really has narrowed very dramatically, to keep that open and prevent, or maybe help to stave off like a full wave of repression that would really be much wider targeted. I hope more widely targeted. I hope that that the United States and other countries that say they have an interest in democratic Tunisia will do just that. We are at the hour. I want to thank all of our viewers. Many of you sent in really, really interesting questions that I think should form the basis of our next POMED event on Tunisia. A lot of really thought-provoking and great questions. So I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to those. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you so much to our speakers, Monica Marks, Mohamed-Dhia Hammami. We so appreciate your being with us and sharing your wisdom and your insights and speaking in such a wide-ranging and candid and thoughtful fashion. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing all of you again at our next POMED event on Tunisia. Thanks again.
Thank you.